Well, good morning. Good morning from San Diego and North America, represented here from the San Diego Historical Games Convention. Good to see my friends Brynen and Brian Train. Guys, how you doing?
Just great. Good morning.
I have my echo on. I'll turn that off. Professional that I am. So exciting day here. We're early in the schedule of the SD HistCon. I got up early and 1 o'clock Pacific time and caught Fred Serval's coffee this morning in Europe, and it was great to see a growing contingent of European attendees to the SD HistCon. I think there were 24 people in the room at one point, which was great, and some early risers in America and then some late nighters from my perspective. But here we are in the morning in San Diego and, of course, morning across North America. Rex and Brian, it might be best if we just start off with you telling us about yourself and letting gamers know about your interest in historical gaming in general. So, Rex, why don't you start?
Well, my day job is I'm a political scientist at McGill University, but I'm also a hobby gamer, and those two things kind of came together. And I both do and teach game design. Most of that game design is in the sort of professional setting with governments or NGOs or others, but also I was involved in the team that developed We Are Coming Nineveh, which is the reason I'm here today.
Yeah, very good.
And I'm Brian Train, and my day job has absolutely nothing to do with games or gaming, or although I'm peripherally involved with education. And games and game design, I think, help me to do my job a little bit better than otherwise. I've been designing war games for over 30 years. I've been designing a lot in irregular warfare, and lately, in the last few years, been concentrating more and more on modern urban warfare. And I've known Rex for a very long time, so over 40 years. And so, as Rex will relate, this game grew out of a class project, and Rex asked me to become involved in the game's development.
Yeah, Brian and I met when I was at university and president of the University of Victoria Strategy and Tactics Club, which was the name of the wargaming club. So we go back to the early 80s, I guess.
Yeah, I was in high school at the time, but I was just still getting into war games. I started playing them in 1979, and Rex is a couple of years older than I, so I was in high school, he was doing his undergraduate degree, but we would get together and have these enormous miniatures battles on the tables in the classroom that we pushed together on a Sunday afternoon. However, Rex had the largest collection of micro armor, but he collected only Soviet and Warsaw Pact stuff, so it was always Russians versus Chinese.
Well, as we all know, Brian, it could happen.
It maybe.
Yeah.
He's still got the collection, as far as I know.
It works for Russians versus Ukrainians now.
Yep.
So.
That's true. That's true.
All my older stuff has become relevant as the Russians pull old stuff out of inventory. I don't even need to update my micro armor.
You should never, ever throw anything away.
Yeah, absolutely. Very funny. Well, again, great having both of you and for spending the time. I remember Brian and I first met at a Consim World Expo in Phoenix, Brian, and I remember you telling me about this Rex Brynen that you were working with on this or that, or talking to, and with the very austere Rex Brynen. I was actually afraid to meet Rex.
don't think I'm particularly frightening, but
Well, now we know that, but at the
well,
time,
Brian and I were out of touch for decades, and then we reconnected because we were both active on the Small Wars Journal messaging board, and it was Brian Rex, yeah. So
yeah,
that's how we reconnected after
a reunion.
several decades, yeah.
Yeah,
awesome.
so we finally met again in person at National Defense University in Washington at one of the Connections conferences between professional wargamers and the hobby and academic sector. You have a session after this one at 8 o'clock about the nexus between professional and civilian wargaming, which I intend to attend.
So the first question and the first thing I'd like to talk about is the game We Are Coming, Nineveh. It's and by the way, congratulations, because it was nominated for a Charles S. Roberts Award. And we don't know yet, but are hopeful and optimistic. But I'd like to hear the story. I think it's quite the interesting and a bit of a complex story about the genesis and development of this game.
Yeah, and it's a good place to start, because I want to give credit to the two people who aren't here who were the impetus behind it. I decided I wanted to teach a conflict simulation course at McGill, essentially a war game design course, although it's broader than wargaming. And in the very, very first time I taught that course, it was a relatively small group of students the first time around. One of the students, Juliette Lemonez, she was doing her undergraduate honors thesis on the Iraqi security forces, particularly the popular mobilization forces. She had never wargamed in her life. She was taking the course because it sounded interested, and she absolutely wanted to do something on Iraq, particularly the Battle of Mosul. Harrison Brewer was another student, undergraduate student in that class, interested in urban architecture. And essentially Juliette forced him to team up because they had to form teams. Harrison had done a little digital wargaming, so he had a little experience, but that was entirely digital. So in terms of board gaming, both of them were absolute neophytes, and they designed what is still the absolute core for the game. Obviously, I was assisting, as I do with all students, but it was their term project. All the basic mechanics of the game were in the term project. There were no major changes, just a lot of polishing after that. And I thought it was really good. So I said, I think you guys could publish this. I'm happy to come on board and help them do it. And I bet my friend Brian would be interested too. And they knew Brian's game designs already from the course. So this was like having a Nobel Prize winner of counterinsurgency and insurgency in irregular warfare jump on board. And so Brian came on board, and we went from there. But full credit to Juliette Harrison, because they were the ones who came up with all the core game mechanics and made it work in a class project.
And even further to the credit of Juliette and Harrison, they have gone on to what I think will be very responsible, interesting, and lucrative careers, unsullied by the experience of having designed war games.
And very appropriate careers, because Juliette went on to get a graduate degree in Middle East security, and Harrison went on to get a graduate degree in urban planning. And it's a game about Middle East insecurity in an urban environment. So
Right.
They followed those interests.
Yeah,
Right.
and everyone's permitted youthful indiscretions, so I think they'll be fine.
Well, it's a great story, and we inherently believe that there's a lot of great things that can come to the hobby from the work that's done at the universities, and we love the idea of getting to see these games. So this is a terrific opportunity to play a game that actually got its genesis in the classroom. So very exciting.
I'll just add, one of the great things with working with students, I mean, usually maybe only 1 or 2 or 3 students in, of course, my class out of 40 who got any wargaming experience at all, is they ask those really basic questions like, why do you do it that way? Why wouldn't this be simpler? Or, I don't think you really need that. Or, They all can't stand shits, by the way. That's why there's a lot of block games come out of that course. So they're unencumbered by the assumptions of what should be in the game, and that, I mean, there's all kinds of drawbacks from not being an experienced wargamer, but they bring fresh eyes to problems, which I think can be really, really helpful and innovative.
Yeah, I think that's important to note. And while they may not have experience in wargaming, I think they might have experience in board gaming. So you're right there. They're sort of untrammeled by a 30 or 40-year history of playing war games, but they also have a knowledge of mechanics found in Euro games. So, you know, they're I guess more experienced and more open to putting in these kinds of alternative mechanics as well. Not always appropriate, but you know, sometimes you can find ideas from anywhere.
Yeah. Now, was it Thomas Edison said that part of his ability to innovate was the fact that he hadn't been professionally trained and educated, right?
Yep.
So I absolutely believe that, and I love the crossover idea between the Euros is also fantastic. Well, tell us about what's the message? What should we take away from this game, and how do its mechanisms serve that story?
Well, I'll start, and then Brian can add in his own views on this, because we haven't talked about it. For me, the most interesting thing from which the whole game works backwards is the ambiguity of the victory conditions. In other words, there's not one thing you're tracking in the game. You're tracking how long it takes the Iraqi security forces to clear the old city of Mosul. You're tracking how costly that is to the Iraqi security forces in terms of military casualties, and you're tracking collateral damage. And all of those are important, and the two sides are not necessarily striving for a win on the same set of criteria, because you get to decide secretly before the game decides what's most important to you. So it may well be that Daesh or ISIS want to see a lot of destruction because they think it makes Mosul ungovernable in the long run, or they want to last a long time so they can boast about how they survived against impossible odds and so forth. And the rules even have a section at the back which says, well, if you've lost but you've done really, really well on one of the criteria, you can just argue and say you have a moral victory regardless of what the victory points say. And then from that, when you're deciding how you're going to conduct the operation and what particular assets you need for it, you need to synchronize those with what you've decided is your overall political goal. So if you want to keep military casualties down, you can invest in an awful lot of indirect fire and airstrikes, but you're going to flatten the city. And in so doing, you might contribute to the Daesh narrative that you don't care about Sunni lives. And so you have to sort of work backwards from these almost ambiguous, complex, what is victory in a battle like that, all the way back to the operational planning you need to do before you start moving anything on the board. And for me, that's the really interesting thing, because I'm a political scientist. Of course, I have a bias on the sort of politics of what it is to win, but I think that's really important. I think we see that in other conflicts as well.
Yeah, I think that, you know, this idea that there's a tremendous amount of ambiguity in what actually is victory, and that in actual conflict, it's not just a series of victory points, right? You may be achieving some goals and not others, and you may not know what those goals are until after things are over. So that's a very interesting application.
Yeah, definitely. It's my background is sort of like in irregular warfare and insurgency, and even before that, war games on sort of more conventional conflicts that are nevertheless very heavily tinged with political content. So the multiple dimensions of victory, the different ways you can create a victory or create conditions of loss and defeat for the other side, is a very important aspect of this game. People have remarked on it a lot, and I'm very glad that they've picked up on that message. I think another thing that the game points out is the pace of urban warfare, just how slow it can be and how extremely destructive it can be. The total area covered by the map is little more than just a few square miles. I think, as Rex points out, you could drive from the airport just off the bottom edge of the map to the city center in about 15, 20 minutes if no one was shooting at you and the roads were clear. But they're not. So it took 4 or 5 months to get that far. And the city was flattened. It took months to consolidate the battle. But of course, Daesh had years, literally years, to prepare the ground. So this goes to show that not every urban battle can be, it doesn't have to be so slow and destructive a siege as this, but it certainly can be that kind of extended and highly destructive exercise. There are other urban battles that were over faster, you know, Hue City, for example, or the Battle of Seoul. But this was still the largest urban battle since World War II or the Korean War, and it just showed how long it can take and just how much. I think another point about the game, and I'm afraid that this has been lost in time, is that the Battle of Mosul happened in 2017, and Juliet and Harrison put this game together in 2017, 2018. This was less than a year after the war had after the battle had finished. Now, because of just the pace of game publishing, it was done by Nuts Publishing over in France, some very nice guys, but those guys, unfortunately, they have to do a lot of regular game business so that they can score a little bit of extra money and time to work on the war game projects, which are central to their hearts. And of course, COVID, all of that conspired to bring the game out in 2023. But I always have this thing on the Winkle about game-based journalism. It would have been great to have released this game, you know, within a year of the battle being fought, because the game, as Rex said, the game was essentially near its final form when the course was over, and Rex and I worked on developing and tuning the mechanics and the cards and so forth afterwards. But the game was essentially finished within a year or two of the battle being over. And it works just fine. You know, it could have been published, if it could have been published closer to the date. I think the point would have been made a little bit sharper on game-based journalism. As it was, about a week or two after the October 7th raids by Hamas, I made a variant of We Are Coming Nineveh for a battle in Gaza City. Because at the time, after the raids, everyone was expecting an Israeli Defense Force invasion of Gaza, and that there would be a climactic and intense urban battle in Gaza City itself, and that Hamas would offer battle. There would be, a huge battle, somewhat like the Battle of Mosul. However, I had this variant put together and available for people who had copies of the game within 2 weeks of the raids, which was my exercise in game-based journalism. However, it was an example of journalistic misfire. All the pundits, all the commentators were saying, oh, going to be a huge battle in Gaza City, going to be a bloodbath on all sides, this sort of thing. But of course, it didn't happen. You know, there was considerable fighting in Gaza City, but it wasn't the climactic battle. And now, of course, we're facing that the main site of combat now is the city of Rafah, which I will not design. I will not design a game on something like that.
Yeah.
But it's an example of how games on contemporary events can be used, through their mechanics or their setting or their inspirations to create other games on contemporary issues.
Well, it's this issue of games-based journalism, Brian. For a normal pundit that's predicting the future, we can debate the cost of being right or wrong, but their cost of creating their opinion and story is actually quite low, while your cost of creating a game in very short order is very high, as it relates to your time and other things. So does that mean that the true application of games-based journalism should be in the context of a year, 2 years, 4 years, or should you continue to do games that come out during a conflict?
I think there's a lot of value in doing it as soon as possible, or even during. I've designed games. I designed a game in 2014 on the Ukrainian crisis. Over the very weekend of that sham referendum that the Russians held as to whether Crimea, should stay part of Ukraine or join Russia, March 2014. The referendum was going to be held on a Monday, and on Friday, I thought, well, I should probably take the weekend and design a political military influence operations game on this problem, and that's what I did. And by Monday, the day of the referendum, I had a print and play copy of this put up on my website. It's called Ukrainian Crisis. It was formally published a few years later by Hollandspiel, but it's always been available for free on my website. And it's probably most applicable to the first 6 months of the Ukrainian crisis, up to the point of, around September of the first accords, when the threat of an overt Russian invasion had passed, at least for 2014. And again, this Gaza thing, and I've designed other games, that take place very soon after the fact. And, Mark Herman and David Doctor, of course, have been working on a Ukraine game for the 2022 fight, the opening campaigns of the present war, and people have been saying, "Oh, too soon, too soon." How can you get an accurate order of battle out of this? I don't think that's so important. What I think is important is to understand through a game the different dimensions of the game and where it can go. So my Ukrainian Crisis game, for example, is got 3 dimensions to it. There's the military intervention, which is actually mostly threatening moves as opposed to an overt invasion, but covert action as well. There's a political game of influencing countries to support or not support Ukraine. And then there's something, call it information operations. And that's kind of the currency of the game. It's kind of perceptions of who has the upper hand. In an early version of the game, I did use the concept of hand from the old Seinfeld episode on the Pez dispenser. I got to have hand in this relationship, Jerry, but it doesn't travel very well, so I dropped it later. But it's still the only war game I think ever with a Seinfeld reference in it, at least in an earlier edition. But the point was, only the
first, Brian.
Yeah, well, maybe it will be only the first. But still, the point is that the game was not, it wasn't excruciatingly detailed this way in terms of like military mechanics or orders of battle or those sorts of things. But the point was to show how the game could be concluded, how the crisis could be resolved on 3 fronts. And in fact, the game could be won by either side by no one having to go to war at all. That's a definite way to play the game. So anyway, I think that's the important part, is to present this sort of, it's a form of long form journalism. It does take time to put together, but I think it can be used by people to kind of explore and think about the idea and work with it interactively in a way that you can't, with a 15-minute news special or even an article or 2 in a magazine.
I've often thought, and Rex, I want to get your thoughts on this idea of using games to communicate or predict near-term conflict. But this the conflict that's going on right now in the Red Sea is a very interesting one and quite complex, right? And at an esoteric level, it looks like the Houthis are lobbing attacks of various kinds into the shipping lanes. But I think it's an interesting question about to really understand it. I think you have to understand everything from insurance to the cost of shipping, to the cost of firing very expensive missiles at very inexpensive drones, and so I've thought that would be an interesting conflict. And I look at our friend Sebastian Bay and the work that he's doing in creating a series of micro games in very short order, right? That are very easy to self-publish in today's world, right? And it would seem that there are just tremendous opportunities for using games to communicate better understandings of conflicts, spark debate, but also have to deal with the controversy of the too soon, Brynen, which I know you've dealt with a number of times. Rex, what do you think about that?
Well, I mean, the reason I teach conflict simulation design at McGill is because it's a very useful tool for thinking through what are the drivers of this conflict, and that applies not only to historical conflict but also to current and future conflict. Obviously, we have less data, we have less information, but it forces you to essentially develop a theoretical model of why is this happening? What are the constraints on it? What are the enablers? What are the key variables? If you were designing a game on what's happening in the Red Sea, why are the Houthis doing this? How much does it relate to Yemeni domestic politics? Answer a lot of it. What are the costs of not intercepting cheap drones or repurposed anti-aircraft missiles used in an anti-shipping role? Very large. You can't just look at the exchange ratio of the interceptor to the drone. It's what happens if the drones start hitting in large numbers. What are the knock-on political and economic effects of that? So it forces you to identify the key variables, and then it forces you to decide which key variables you're keeping in and which ones you aren't. So because any war game model has to be relatively parsimonious or it becomes unplayable. So you've got that trade-off of, yes, it's relevant, but it's not relevant enough that I need to put it in the game, or I really need to have this in the game because I think it's important for understanding or learning or people getting narrative engagement out of the game. So I teach it as a tool. I mean, I teach conflict simulation precisely as a tool for understanding conflict. That might be the Red Sea. One of the game designs this past term was in fact on that broader conflict. So you could lob missiles into the Red Sea. It could also be another conflict, global warming, resource management in humanitarian disaster, anything where you have really difficult choices. But I've long argued that it's just a form of theorizing about relationships between variables, which as a social scientist is my day job. It's just a lot more fun to do in a game.
I'm really happy that you mentioned Sebastian Bay and the Georgetown University Wargaming Society and these small games they're turning out. That's an example of exactly what I'm talking about. And I think that you don't need excruciatingly fine details of orders of battle or technical specs to put together a game that sketches in the major dimensions of a problem and the directions it could go in. A number of years ago, Rex and I were working at a Military Operations Research Society event on rapid wargaming design, where we were working with professional military people who were analysts and just working with them just to help them to say, okay, here's your problem. Here's, the kind of important things that you need to dig out of it. Here's some mechanics you can use to illustrate and explore it. And you can put this kind of thing together very quickly. And since then, at these conferences, connections conferences, things like that, we have events where people come together, they pitch ideas, to each other saying, okay, I want to do a game on this contemporary topic. What are your ideas on this? What's important? What's not important? How would you handle it? We have game jam sessions, that sort of thing. I mean, this whole idea of news games is something that there's a game scientist, I don't know how to pronounce his name correctly, Ian Bogost was a theorist. It's still a writer on computer games. The academic field of game studies is like 99% related to digital stuff. And I've never seen an academic field so willfully ignorant of its past, because everything, comes out of analog games. Even every passively decent computer war game starts as a paper prototype. However, about 12 or 13 years ago, Bogos wrote this book on news games, and his idea was that modern journalism, as it then was, could be partially saved by making digital games on contemporary events. And it wouldn't have to be necessarily armed conflicts. It could be, climate change or dairy industry or narco trafficking or something like that. Putting these games together and putting them up on websites as an adjunct to digital journalism. And it was a startling book because there isn't one mention in it anywhere of analog games. There's a mention in it of crossword puzzles, and that's about it. But the rest of it is all verbal about, these games will do this. And of course, nothing of the sort happened for a number of reasons. The news cycle is too fast. The business cycle won't make it pay. I mean, in the end, you can't find enough people to do it. And in the end, it just came to nothing. So a couple of years ago, he wrote an obituary for his own book. However, the whole idea of using games to explore political and social problems, I found examples of this going back to the 1660s, with the invention of movable type and lithography. And so this whole tradition of analog games to explore contemporary political and social and military issues, it continues today. Thanks to the internet, I can use the internet to distribute copies of the game through print and play. But the tradition continues. But the promise of digital news games, that fell apart.
I'll just add as a kind of appendix to what Brynen had to say about that game that got developed at the Moores course on war game design. The project we were working with a few students on was about lines of effort against ISIS. It was another counter ISIS game, but much more strategic. Rand Corporation thought they liked it enough that they actually developed a version of it and ran it as a kind of news game in order to acquaint people with the strategic choices in the counter ISIS campaign. And that was developed literally in a few hours. I mean, we had sort of 2/3 of the day, half day design session. Someone put all the bits together overnight. It was playable by the next day. And then the following year, it became an actual beautiful looking Rand game that they ran with, congressional staffers and folks like that to let them better visualize and understand the various lines of effort against ISIS in Syria and Iraq.
Yep, that was a fun week. And you got to watch what you say because you never know when Rand might pick it up and run with it.
One of the things that I'm encumbered with as a hobby designer is this obligation to make a game that's fun, right? And a part of that is that you want to sell a decent number of units, right? I mean, and I guess we all want our games to be in a lot of people's hands, and that's not about money. That's just about, we don't make enough money to really warrant doing this. So it's really just about telling a story and letting people read our story. But it would seem that one of the things that might be missed in the rapid development of a game is this burden of fun, right? And I don't, and perhaps that's not an issue. The Volko and I have had a number of debates about this issue of fun in professional wargaming. And he says that it's not, this issue of having fun in a professional wargame is not absent, because in a professional wargame, not only do you have the sanctity of the model and the story and the lesson, but you also have to keep people interested in playing the game. And if it's not fun, then you'll lose your audience. But how does this idea that a game should be not only interesting and useful, but also fun play into this concept of professional wargaming?
Well, I design a lot of professional games about topics that aren't fun. So I've just spent 3 years working with Save the Children and Johns Hopkins Center for Humanitarian Health on games training humanitarian aid workers to respond to epidemic disease, which on the surface is not a particularly fun topic. I think a lot depends on what fun is to the audience that you're working with. So they can get satisfaction in other ways. There could be the kind of humor you'd find in the field shows up in those two particular games. If anyone wants to look, they can look up Ready Initiative. The simulations are played on browsers. There's about an hour and a half each. There's a lot of fun stuff that is kind of fun if you work in that field. You recognize the characters. There's the super eager but rather incompetent intern. There's the driver who knows more than you do. There's stuff said at the coffee machine, which you should listen to because it turns out to be important, office scuttlebutt and what have you. There's your phone constantly buzzing. All of those things are recognized by people who work in the front lines in places like Sudan or Gaza or where have you. And there's a kind of fun from the professional validation of making it feel like the real thing, even though the whole point of the two games is to how do you respond to epidemic disease outbreaks in which thousands and thousands of people die. So there could be satisfaction from victory. That can be the fun. You always have to think, I think when you're in professional game design, is who is the audience? What keeps them engaged? Fun can be a problem too. If people start playing for fun, you can run into sort of gamer mode where people are doing things to win. Famously the Swedes had problems with when they were running games with cadets, the cadets putting all their support units in front of their combat units to act as speed bumps to slow down a Russian advance, which as a guy who used to serve in a support unit, doesn't sound like a good idea to me. But they were having too much fun. They weren't thinking about how would I defend Sweden against a Russian assault. They were thinking, I really, really want to beat the game. So I think in a professional setting, you're trying to leverage engagement to deliver on the desirable game effects, whether they're educational or analytical or some mix of that, but also recognizing that it could be a problem or someone could take offense or someone could say, my mother died in that. I mean, I run a peace building game at McGill, and that's an enormous problem because my students come from all over. I've had students saying, well, I should let you know my father was killed in the Rwandan genocide, so this game might be a bit sensitive for me. So it's always a case of objective audience and how you want to leverage that emotional response, whether it's fun or other kinds of things.
Yeah, I'm a little loath to use the word fun, especially with this, with respect to professional games, but for hobby games too, even the word hobby is kind of pejorative, non-professional. I would instead use the words, I would use words like immersion. Immersion and it's a form of, it's like a form of role playing. There's the talk, Huizinga talks about the magic circle that people step into when they play a game. So people accept that, some of the rules of life are a little suspended, but it's for the sake of telling a story. So when people are playing a game, they're creating a narrative, they're telling a story, they're working through a story together. So there's the immersion, there's the fascination, there's the basic interest in the subject matter in the first place. And of course, as Richard Feynman said, the pleasure of finding things out, the pleasure of exploring, an issue in a game form, in an interactive way, with other people, which is something that you simply do not get by sitting and, reading a web page or a newspaper article or magazine article by yourself. So you get that, you definitely get that. And that's where an analog of fun emerges. And as far as making money and sales, well, I don't care. I just, I was involved in, at the beginning of designing war games. The first publishing company that I was involved with was the Microgame Design Group with Kerry Anderson. And we were a non-profit wargaming publishing company by intent, by design, not by outcome, which I think made us unique. Yeah. But the idea was simply to give physical form to somebody's ideas and game designs and push them into people's hands for the price of what it costs to print them up and mail them. And I've always subscribed to that. And that's why things like print and play and just making things available through PDFs, it's costless. And people can pick it up or lay it down, leave it alone. It's all one to me. However, I do like, I don't like to think I'm just dropping pebbles into a well, but still, at the very least, it's a way of designing a game on something. For me, it's a way of researching it and exploring. I have to explore the problem myself and then design a game on it. So that's how a part of how I set the world in order in my mind about things. So it's for me first, and my understanding first, and I come to that understanding, I want to share it with other people, or at least my interpretation. And, and if it bugs someone enough that they go and they design their competing game, or they read another book or something like that, that's great. That's just as good.
Well, we should, Brian, you and I should do another show on that and maybe get Rex in with us. But, the question of quantity of people is interesting. That play the game. And if I thought there were 6 people going to play my game, I probably wouldn't do it. I would maybe make it and play it by myself, but I wouldn't go through the necessary publishing development, right? Unless I thought there were a meaningful number of people that would be interested in it and play it. But, it's interesting. And again, I'm not surprised, Brian, to find out that you're also anti-fun. So based on our
yes,
history.
We must all sit quietly and take notes.
Hey, we have an excellent, thoughtful question from fellow Canadian Andrew Buchholz, also a member of the ST-HIS team. And he's talking about, people doing ahistorical things and what can you do as a designer to minimize that. Rex, my first thought with our Swedish friends putting support units up front was, well, for some reason they're rewarded for putting support units up front, right? Or not penalized enough.
There's no penalty for losing clerks. Yeah.
Yeah. So
your supply isn't affected, or your chow is not affected, your morale's not affected. No, it's a really interesting question, because by the same token, you don't want to prevent innovative responses, right? I mean, warfare is full of people doing things that they weren't supposed to be able to do. You can't march elephants over the Alps. Why would anyone land in Normandy? It doesn't have a harbor and it's too far away from the Channel ports, or on and on. So you need to balance out, and do ridiculous things versus recognizing that some of the great military successes have been innovative. They haven't been doctrinal. I always had this problem with professional military games and handcuffing people too tightly to doctrine, and then we go and celebrate all the commanders who didn't behave doctrinally. I think what you want to do is you want to have the appropriate penalties or risks. There are historical examples in Burma of using admin troops to secure ground. So, maybe you don't entirely want to make that impossible, but there should be real consequences to doing it. In We Are Coming Nineveh, you don't have to build your defense around the old city. If you want, you can try and defend all of West Mosul. I don't suggest you do it, because it's a hell of a lot easier to defend the old city. You just need to make sure you don't get outflanked too quickly and have your supply line cut off. But we haven't stopped people from doing the ahistorical thing. We just hope that the game system penalizes you in appropriate ways. So that's my preference, is to think, why didn't they do this? And let's make sure that the game system recreates the why you wouldn't want to do that. But isn't absolutely handcuffing you into doing things a very, very conventional way. Because then I think we lose something about what alternative strategies they might have been. And Brian and I have had a discussion about this. So we're at a very early stage of thinking about the Battle of Marawi, which was also a government versus Islamists, ISIS affiliated, in the Philippines, going on pretty much the same time as the Battle of Mosul. Very similar in some ways, but a tenth the scale. But grinding month-long urban combat. Now that battle has 2 phases. It has a phase where the insurgents grab a bunch of things, and the Filipinos are absolutely on their back foot, and then a sort of grinding siege afterwards. And we're debating how much of that initial battle do we want to have. Do we want to dispense with it and go straight to the siege? But theoretically, the insurgents could have seized the barracks and then had a lot more firepower than they had. They tried it and they didn't pull it off. Maybe they would have, in that initial period when they were sort of driving all over the city and grabbing checkpoints and they could have done something different. So how much do we want the insurgents to actually have opportunity to do something slightly different at the beginning, which changes the nature of the siege, or do we want to go straight to the siege? And we haven't decided. We're kind of, I think, both some kind of mini game or card game or something at the beginning to capture that first very fluid, very mobile phase of the battle before you get to something that looks a lot more like West Mosul. But that has been a choice. How much do we want to handcuff you into exactly the way the battle was fought out in 2017 versus other tactical and operational choices that the insurgents and to some extent the Filipino government could have made in the initial hours and days?
Yeah, that is the stage we're at, and I think that's the way we're going to go. Is that you could go straight to the historical siege and skip that sort of pregame, but what happens in the pregame would set up some of the conditions and parameters of the game that follows. So you at least you have the choice of doing one or the other. This is an idea that I had. I'm pleased to take a look at it this way, because years and years ago I designed a game on Budapest 1956. The Soviet intervention there, and at the time I had an idea of a sort of pre-game that would have set up some of the conditions for the battle itself, based on the kind of political maneuvering and sort of political decisions that have been made beforehand. And as it turned out, I did the game just on the battle itself and not that sort of pre-game. Years and years later, I did Knights of Fire, which is a game about Budapest, with David Turtzi, and we created a link game with Days of Ire, which was a game that David had designed a year or two before on the October 1956 revolution. So we created a link game between the revolution in one month and then the Soviet intervention in the following month. So in a sense, I did arrive at that. I did get that pre-game, that sort of preamble to the battle, and I think that's important because these games. We were talking a moment ago about scripting, not scripting too much. And it's important really to give context as to why a battle was fought the way it was, where it was, in addition to the how.
And one of the things that I think that Julia and Harrison did very well in Nineveh is that is a game in two phases. You're deciding before the game is even played what capabilities do you want to bring to the fight. You do not have to bring exactly the same capabilities that they historically brought to the fight. If you particularly want to do a river crossing supported by a heliborne insertion northwest of the old city, which theoretically they could have done. They didn't do it for, I think, very good reasons. But if you want to do that and try and cut the old city off very quickly, you have the opportunity to invest in that capability at the beginning of the game and allow you to move forces, bring in additional forces, and do that kind of encirclement. You will find that those units are going to be tough to supply and they risk being cut off and so forth, which is a reason it wasn't actually done. But when you play Nineveh, you spend time deciding what additional capabilities you want to bring to the game. And some of those allow you to do things which were historically doable, but not particularly good choices. There are things I wouldn't buy in capabilities in Nineveh, but they're put in there so that you can try that out and say, oh, how would this have worked? That's it. One of the things I do like about their design is this two-phase. You really have to decide. You got to do your operational planning before you even start playing on the board with Nineveh, because you not only have to decide what your most important objective is, but what assets and capabilities and training and deconfliction and everything else you want to bring to the battlefield in order to then support that operational goal. You don't just start setting the pieces up and playing.
Yeah, this idea of a static start is really another hobby construct, right? It's not realistic. Life doesn't have a fixed start and a fixed stop and a fixed measurement of success.
And a constant pace of operations. And again, I'm going to praise, I think it was Harrison came up with this. One of my favorite cards in Nineveh is an operational pause card, which you don't do it. You play it as Iraqi security forces and you don't actually do anything for a turn. You just reorganize your forces. You bring logistics in, resupply, you rotate, you reposition, which is it's built into military plans all the time. We're going to have operational pause here, and then we're going to go on to phase two. How many hobby war games do you fight consistently like a giant meat grinder for exactly 12 turns and then it's over? And yet almost no campaigns are actually fought that way.
Yeah.
A card that's nothing. Maybe this should be the Seinfeld reference to get back to what Brian was saying at the beginning. It's a card about nothing, right? You play it and you can't actually engage in combat that turn. You just move stuff around better position yourself for the next turn.
Well,
Yada, yada, yada.
If the card was suitably named, it would be the second card with a reference, a second game with a reference to Seinfeld, of course. Well, in closing, I'd like to hear some predictions for the future. What about
the world or gaming?
Well,
or
yes,
narrow that
and the answer is yes, Rex. I'd like to hear a little bit about what's next for you all, and you've already talked a little bit about that. But what are the interesting changes that you see coming in the world of historical gaming?
You start, Brynen.
I don't know. In the time since I stopped working on We Are Coming Nineveh, which is 2018, I've designed over a dozen games since then. Half of them have been on the urban theme. I've been doing work recently with the 40th Infantry Division, California Army National Guard's Urban Operations Planner course. I designed a game for them, and I designed on urban warfare, and I designed a variant of it for a Canadian Army battalion commander. I've designed other games on different aspects of urban combat, modern urban combat. This is something that I find is really, it's the coming thing. It has always been the coming thing, but it's really starting to arrive now, and it's going to be very nasty, and people need to study this problem, professional and civilian alike. So I've been doing a lot of work on that kind of thing. But I've been designing games on a lot of other topics as well. But I think as far as contemporary gaming goes, we would be well served to kind of spend more time studying that problem, urban warfare, and particularly urban irregular warfare. But anyway, that's another whole broadcast. I'd be happy to go into with you another time, Harold.
Yeah.
So, I mean, one thing, it's not new, but I think it's been very positive, is over the last decade or more, and the influence here is really coming from the Euros, is an emphasis on game design elegance, that simply adding in more complex bells and whistles doesn't always get you a better gameplay experience, and it acts as a barrier to the hobby. So I'm really pleased to see a lot of, I think, accessible but historically realistic war games out there, Shores of Tripoli and so forth, that I can use as entry-level games for students, because I'm sure as hell not going to put Campaign for North Africa in front of them and say, let's play. So I think that's been a very positive trend. I think that's a trend that grows the hobby. I think it's a trend that makes it, the board gaming industry generally is taking off. It's huge these days. I think that becomes our starter drug for wargaming. Is this game is relatively easy to play, and you don't have to look at a CRT with 17 pages of modifiers before you can play it. I think we're going to continue to see that, because I think the market rewards it. But I also think it's good for the hobby, because people start there and then they go on to more complex things as they develop their preferences. In terms of what I'm working on personally, it tends to be a function of who sends me a really cool email about, would you help with this game project? So, I had no idea I'd be spending 2.5 years working on infectious disease games until that happened. And that happened partly because of other stuff, including the COVID pandemic, where I was working on COVID vaccine rollout games for the federal government. I'm doing a bunch of stuff with CNN on training journalists, which initially was just in Abu Dhabi once a year, but it looks like I'd be doing it in Mexico City. So talk about news games. Those are journalist training games. They're a bit more like LARPs than they are, what we would think of as war games, but hey, it's fun. I have a lot. So for me, I'm working with another part of the federal government on an exercise right now. So for me, it tends to be, I open my email and someone says, would you like to work on this? And my criteria, I'm far enough along in my career that my criteria are, does it sound fun? And do I think it's socially or otherwise useful? And if it meets, and sometimes they pay me, which is nice, but that's actually the least important. So I've stopped planning my life. I mean, I had all these very cool projects keep coming across my desk that I had no idea existed until I opened the email. So I have ceased planning my academic life, just because cool gaming opportunities keep showing up.
Yeah, I'd like to echo Rex's comments about the cross fertilization between more general board wargaming and historical wargaming. In biology, I think they call this hybrid vigor, and that's why a mutt makes a better pet and a more successful dog than a purebred.
Right. Now you've really done it, because we're going to have all the purebred owners watching this going after Brynen. So he's managed to go through no controversy. We covered the conflict in the Middle East. We're fine, and he's just blown in the last 30 seconds on
I had to put my foot in it.
The dog
purebred comment from the purebred Canadian. I'm shocked and amazed. It's been great having you, and so many topics that I'd like to investigate further. Rex, you talk about the growth of the hobby and the growth of board gaming in general. And I think, a lot of what we do at SDHisCon is we try to knock down the barriers between this massive group of people that love to play games and the games that we all love. And so,
let me just say, the most frequent comment I get on the course evaluations for my wargaming course is, I had no idea this existed.
Yeah.
And then some enthusiastic comments about wargaming. That is the single most frequent comment I get. So there's a lot of room to grow the hobby.
Yeah, I think so too. And a lot of people interested in strategic games, and tons of opportunity. And I also think it's true of the, kind of barriers between professional gaming and hobby gaming. And Brian, you said something else earlier that I thought was incredibly interesting that would warrant an entire hour of discussion, but that hobby gaming can be perceived as a pejorative. To me, not at all, but I would understand where a professional wargamer might not want to be called a hobbyist, and which is, just more interesting cross-sectional stuff that we need to be careful and to tamp down and make sure that everybody gets as much access as is legally sound and appropriate.
Well, maybe the panel following this one on professional and civilian wargaming, the Nexus, will maybe explore that.
Yes, and I've had some discussions with them, and that's certainly a hot topic. So I look forward to that. Of course, I'll be having coffee with anyone that wants to attend. But gentlemen, thanks. What a pleasure to talk to both of you together, and I hope we can do this again soon.
Absolutely. Thanks for putting it together, Harold.
Thanks so much. Bye-bye.